But there is a bright side. Peace negotiations are on the way. They are moving slowly, but hopefully we're going to have results. So this session is sponsored by the Doha Forum. I've been in the Doha Forum many times, and it's an amazing platform to understand the conflicts in the Middle East, the reality of the Middle East, not only from a Western perspective, but from a local perspective. So I encourage you to follow this conversation from Amy MacKinnon, Robin Wright, and Dr. Majed Al-Ansari, who is joining us from Qatar, and who I had the pleasure to interview him last year in the Doha Forum. Welcome our esteemed panels.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm delighted to be joined by Robin Wright, who is a joint fellow with the United States Institute for Peace and the Wilson Center, contributing writer for The New Yorker, and has covered the Middle East for 50 years. And joining us via Zoom, we have His Excellency, Dr. Majed Al-Ansari, spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry of Qatar. Now, as we said at the top, we have 20 minutes, and we have to cover what's next for the Middle East. So I would ask you both to please, as best you can, be concise in your remarks, because there is a lot to cover. As a journalist myself, I want to start with the breaking news from today, which is that Israel has launched its most extensive series of strikes on Hezbollah targets across Lebanon. I will start with you, Dr. Majed. I mean, what is your response to this recent escalation that we have seen between Israel and Hezbollah? And what avenues are there for a potential off-ramp to avert an all-out war between these two parties?
Thank you, Amy, and all the thanks to Concordia and the team for having us. Obviously, since day one, we've been warning that this is a breaking moment for the Middle East, and that one of the main priorities that we have set out from day one is making sure that we contain this conflict in its current parameters and not allow for regional spillover, because that would be a domino effect that nobody would have any control over. And what we are seeing right now in Lebanon is a very clear indication that the dominoes are falling, and that if we don't step in, all of us collectively in the international community, to make sure that there is no escalation to the level of an open war between Hezbollah and Israel, that we are going to be seeing even worse shades of human catastrophe in the region than the terrible pictures that we've been seeing all through the last year.
And Robin, I mean, it seems that the gameplay here by Israel is to try and escalate to de-escalate, to try and encourage Hezbollah to pull back. I know you've covered the group for a very long time. How do you think they're going to respond to this recent round of escalation?
Well, I don't think, thank you for having me. First of all, I'm a great fan of the Doha Forum, and this is a particularly important subject. You and I both just came from a session with the president of Iran, who took office just over a month ago. And I don't think that Iran or Hezbollah wants a broader war, and the question is, are we sucked into it? And I think if you looked at this conflict standing on top of the world looking down, what is different from past conflicts is that you have 10 different conflicts across the region that have their own flashpoint, their own issues, their own players that have merged into one big conflict. And it's no longer an issue of the United States and Qatar and Egypt just unraveling the Gaza conflict, because each of these conflicts, including the conflict with Hezbollah, plays out in ways that intersect. And so it's going to be very hard, I think, to unravel this easily, even though I think that the major combatants here really don't want a wider war.
Dr. Majed, Robin referred to, obviously, the ongoing ceasefire talks, which Qatar has played a key role in trying to broker a ceasefire in Gaza and to secure the release of the remaining hostages. There's been a lot of back and forth on this deal. You know, when we hear from the White House, when we're briefed by senior administration officials in the Biden administration, they always tell us it's close. That the deal is 90% of the way there. Jake Sullivan has said it's down to the nitty-gritty, and yet there is still no deal. How close is it, from your perspective, from Qatar?
Amy, I can tell you that while we remain hopeful, we are certainly not optimistic that the deal can be accomplished in the next couple of days. As you might have heard, various officials from all the negotiating countries say that we are at an impasse right now, and we don't see a very clear way out of it. That said, negotiations continue and talks continue, and we have kept the channels of communication open to make sure that when there is a window of opportunity, it can be utilized within the discussion. Obviously, the current escalation in Lebanon, the massacres taking place in Gaza on a daily basis is making it near impossible to bridge the gap in the negotiations. I can tell you very clearly, Amy, we are at a moment now where if we don't collectively as an international community jump in and push both sides to an agreement, we are going to end up here in the Middle East at least with an escalation of a level that we haven't seen in decades, and that we are going to see much more worse pictures than the one that we are seeing right now. And I think there is a lack of enthusiasm over that what is happening right now. If you look at what we are doing around this, because of the various issues, as rightly said by Robin, that are basically grabbing attention from all sides of the globe. But it is a very important moment where, as Robin said, all these conflicts have been encapsulated into this Gaza conflict, and unless we work on it together right now, it doesn't seem very optimistic, to be honest, at this moment.
And just staying on the question of the talks for a moment, I mean, I've heard from multiple sources that they feel like the negotiators, that Qatar, the US, and Egypt want this deal more than the parties themselves, meaning more than Hamas, more than the Netanyahu government. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I would say that we were committed from day one and still are to reaching a deal. I think for all of us in the region, especially those who live in close proximity to the humanitarian disaster that takes place right now, we have a vested interest in achieving peace and de-escalation. All of our lives have been affected by this. If you ask my 6-year-old daughter today about the situation in the region, she will tell you about the atrocities in Gaza because she's seeing it every day. So this is coming into our homes, it's affecting our children, it's affecting our livelihoods, our economies, and therefore, obviously, everybody in the region is gearing for a deal that could de-escalate. We see and we know very closely here in the region what it means when such escalation happens and it becomes uncontrolled. We know how disruptive all the players in the game right now can be in the field, and we know how weak the state structure is in our part of the world. So it is very important for us, certainly. Now, obviously, when you are working in any kind of mediation of such, you will find that the parties that would be the least interested in reaching a deal, especially when the level of escalation and level of animosity is as high as it is today, and the trauma on both sides is quite terrible. But it's our job in the international community to push both sides, kicking and screaming, into a deal.
Robin, as you mentioned, we both just came from a press conference with the new president of Iran, which, thanks to Robin's intervention, was on the record, so we can now talk about it. What stuck out for you? I mean, could you share a couple of impressions with the audience about what we heard today from Pezeshkian?
Well, remember, this is his first time in New York. He's been president for just over, I think, 5 weeks. And there's a sense that his administration is more interested in diplomacy and a way out to bring some economic relief to Iran. It suffered enormously under sanctions, more than 1,500 that were imposed by the Trump administration and hundreds more by the Biden administration. And that there's, I think, an interest, although he didn't say it directly, in some kind of more direct conversation with American officials. Until now, they've kind of done this crazy, the Americans will stay in a hotel, the Iranians across the street, and they have diplomats walk between the two of them. And that hasn't worked, and so it's really a direct dialogue. He didn't come out and say it. He speaks at the UN tomorrow. Clearly, Iran is a major player in all of this as the primary funder, supporter, trainer, armor of its various allies across the region that have attacked Americans, for more than four decades. So we all hope that this is a different moment. I'm not sure it will be. Again, we all get back into how these conflicts intersect. I just have to add that on the point of how close are we, Dr. Majed, I did the shuttles between Syria and Israel in the 1990s during the Clinton administration, and Dennis Ross would come back on the plane and say, oh, we're only this far apart. And the next trip is only, oh, we're only this far apart. And then it was the next this far apart, this far, and of course, it never happened. And that while we wish you all, extraordinary luck, because this is a war that will play out not just today or over the past year, but will affect generations, really, generations. But it's hard to see, frankly, how you get there and how you unravel the damage, whether it's political, diplomatic, psychological, or structural in terms of the damage physical that's been done.
Just to pick up on that point, another kind of disconnect I think that we see, my colleagues and I have written about this, when we talk, you hear from the Biden administration, their plan is get a ceasefire in Gaza, get the hostages out, proceed with a Saudi-Israel normalization deal to broker diplomatic ties and to kind of carve a new future for the region. Whenever I hear from Israeli officials, it's we're at the beginning of a multi-front war with Iran. That we now need to address, that Israel has come out of October 7th with a much more expansive interpretation of its security. So do you think, are we at the end of a war, with at least the kind of most intense phase of the IDF's military operations in Gaza wrapping up? Are we at the end of a war, or are we at the beginning of a much wider conflict?
Well, we all hope that we're nearing the end of the Gaza war. I don't, frankly, think anything's going to happen until after the election and possibly until after the inauguration. I hope I'm wrong. I really do. It's gut, after covering every war in the Middle East since 1973. There are regional tensions. I think the scenario has changed. It used to be end of the Gaza war, normalization with Saudi Arabia, but the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia said in recent days, no normalization until a two-state solution. And that's just not viable. That's not something Bibi Netanyahu wants to talk about. Frankly, there is no post-war plan. Dr. Majed may know far more than I do, but one of the problems is you have the different phases to get to an end of the war, release of hostages, and so forth, but we don't have what happens next. And the Americans have an idea, but there's not buy-in yet, and that's the danger.
Dr. Majed, I want to come back to you on that point of a day after scenario. This has been a real point of contention. Netanyahu has been very reluctant to speak about, what the plans are, what happens to Gaza at the end of the war. What role, how is Qatar viewing this, and what role could Doha play in any reconstruction efforts?
Well, Amy, as Robin rightly mentioned, talking about the day after is quite difficult because the day we are at right now is unending. We are at a situation now where the war, instead of dying down and into a deal, it's actually expanding into a multifaceted war with Hezbollah and other actors being part of it. And therefore, to imagine a day after right now would be an intellectual exercise, no more than that. The way out of it is to compartmentalize and to make sure that we understand what compartmentalization here means. We need, first of all, a deal that gets the hostages back home, that helps end or remedy the trauma of 7th of October and post that. We need de-escalation in Gaza. We need for civilians to stop dying in order for us to be able to start the second phase where we can talk about a day after in Gaza. But to be honest, right now, when we see the escalation that is taking place in Lebanon, when we see the escalation in other places by the Houthis or others in the region, it doesn't seem like the day after scenario can be even articulated right now within the current parameters. What we need right now is containment, and this is what I started with, and I think it's very important for all of us to keep in mind right now that the only thing we can do right now is to make sure that we contain the conflict in the current parameters, because it is widening and it will have repercussions, as Robin said, on generations to come. When we deal with the aftermath, hopefully, of this war, we will have to deal with a generation of radicalized youth, not only in the Muslim world, but in the world as a whole. We've seen demonstrations in the US, we've seen demonstrations in Jakarta, we've seen language that is very inflammatory in East and West and North and South. So this war will have repercussions on the psyche of a whole generation, unless we are able, as an international community, to come together and help fix it. And the problem will remain as long as the Palestinian people don't have any hope in the future, and the Israeli people don't have any hope in security, the problem will continue escalating, and this will only be one cycle of violence. But in the course to finding a way out of this, we have to keep in our minds to compartmentalize and find solutions for every one of these problems in an innovative way, and to come together in order to find a way out of the crisis.
And just quickly, we have just under 2 minutes remaining. As we are here for the UN General Assembly, obviously one of the focus of this week is going to be the three major conflicts going on right now in the world, in Sudan, in Gaza, in Ukraine. In many ways, very different conflicts with different causes and different routes out. But I'm curious whether you see any connectivity between these three crises.
I mean, obviously, if you look at the bigger picture, as Robin said in the beginning, all of these conflicts diverge in a way that is unprecedented. And the problem is, it's basically the bandwidth of the international community has been stretched so thin that we are unable now to deal, for example, with the situation in Sudan, while there are other international regional actors who are still playing a negative role over there. We are unable to deal with the situation in Ukraine. We are unable to deal with the situation in Gaza because of that level of stretching of international community's perspectives. But the problem there is that we can't work on it from a compartmentalization format. So if you look at Russia-Ukraine, for example, we are helping in the mediation of a reunification of children that were affected by the war with their families. In Sudan, we have a humanitarian role that we are playing in order to allow for humanitarian aid to go in beyond the conflict zones. In Gaza, we are working towards the deal between the hostages. We need this kind of small players, small and medium players that work in these issues in a way that would be able to bring about not an end to the conflict, but to lessen the effects of this conflict and hope bringing it to a more humane situation where we can start talking about peace.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Majed. Unfortunately, on that note, we will have to wrap up. Thank you for joining us. Hope you can join us in person next time. Robin, it was a pleasure speaking with you as always, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.